The year is 1879. A heavy, macabre silence clings to the air of Willow Creek Valley, a place nestled so deep in the unforgiving heart of the American frontier that the whisper of civilization rarely dared to reach it. The soil here is rich, fertile, and according to local folklore, cursed. It's the kind of land men would kill for, and in the case of the notorious Brass Ankle Brothers, the kind of land they forced unspeakable arrangements for. We begin not with the beginning of the story, but with the chilling climax of their reign. Imagine, if you will, a single dilapidated farmhouse, its windows like empty, haunted eyes staring out into the twilight. Inside, the last flicker of a kerosene lamp casts long, disturbing shadows that dance with the cold truth. On this night, every single member of the Brass Ankle family, men, women, and children, was gathered under duress. The reason: a shocking, legally forbidden document, known only to them as the Covenant of the Soil. This document, scribed on brittle, yellowish parchment, outlined the most grotesque and horrifying succession plan ever conceived, a plan designed to ensure the land, their banned inheritance, would never be divided. The youngest brother, Elias, stood at the head of the long, scarred dining table, his face a mask of cold, unblinking intensity. He held a small, antique brass key, a detail that gives the brothers their infamous name, and with it, he was about to unlock a macabre secret that had been sealed for nearly a decade. What followed was not a celebration, but a forced, silent acknowledgement of a terrible fate. Every member present knew the weight of the arrangement. They understood the price of the Brass Ankle legacy, a price measured not in coin but in their very humanity. This is the moment the truth vanished into the darkness, a truth we must now painstakingly unearth, piece by disturbing piece, from the dusty archives of a forgotten time. What was in the Covenant of the Soil, and what did the Brass Ankle Brothers demand of their own blood? The answer is a cold case wrapped in ancestral horror. To understand the monstrous acts of 1879, we must first anchor ourselves in the history of the Brass Ankle Brothers, Silas, Elias, and Tobias. They weren't born into wealth, but they were born with an almost banned obsession with land. Their father, a harsh, unforgiving pioneer, had scratched out a meager living on this valley floor, perpetually terrified that his hard-won acres would be splintered and lost upon his death. It was a crippling fear that he successfully transplanted, like a poisoned seed, into the minds of his three sons. The name Brass Ankle itself is rooted in a disturbing early incident. As young boys, their father, in a moment of crazed discipline meant to symbolize their immovable bond to the soil, had them all wear heavy, custom-made brass rings locked around their ankles. These rings were supposedly a constant, physical reminder that they were tethered to the earth and to each other, a macabre piece of psychological conditioning. By the 1860s, these rings were long gone, melted down perhaps, but the psychological shackle remained. The brothers grew into men who were ruthlessly unified by a singular, horrifying goal: to expand their holdings no matter the cost. Their methods, even in the lawless West, were considered extreme. Neighbors' land titles mysteriously vanished. Boundaries shifted under the cover of night, and anyone who dared to challenge their expanding territory often met with an unfortunate and permanent end, filed away as a cold case by the indifferent county sheriff. Yet, the real terror wasn't the external threat. It was the internal one, the terrifying thought of dividing the empire they were building. This dread is what ultimately spawned the twisted logic of the Covenant of the Soil, a document that moved the forbidden concept of ownership from mere legality into the realm of blood and curse. The question is, how did three men, driven only by greed, elevate their control to such a macabre, family-wide arrangement? Silas, the eldest, was the planner, the dark, calculating mind behind the logistics of their land acquisition. Elias, the one who gripped the brass key in the opening scene, was the enforcer, a man whose silence held more threat than any shout. Tobias, the youngest before Elias, was the most complex and perhaps the most disturbing, the charismatic front, capable of twisting community perception just enough to keep the law at bay. Together, They were an unholy trinity of ambition and control. By 1870, their contiguous property was vast, swallowing up smaller farms and incorporating miles of riverfront. They had achieved what their father only dreamed of, but this achievement brought with it a new, more profound anxiety, the inevitable entropy of inheritance. The law stated that upon the death of one brother, his share would be divided among his widow and children. This, to the brass-ankle mind, was a banned form of destruction, a surgical splitting of their unified domain. They saw their land not as individual parcels, but as a single, living entity, and the thought of its dismemberment invoked a primal, horrifying rage. It was during a particularly harsh winter, huddled in the same creepy farmhouse, that the first drafts of the Covenant of the Soil were drawn up. They didn't consult a lawyer. They consulted their own dark pathology. The legal precedent they were setting was forbidden in every sense of the word, crossing moral and legal lines with a chilling casualness. The document's primary, initial stipulation was simple on the surface, yet macabre in its implication. No single person could inherit property from a brass-ankle male unless they also agreed to live permanently on the core Willow Creek holding, under the direct authority of the surviving brothers. This was the first, chilling step into control. But what followed was a series of increasingly disturbing clauses that guaranteed the family's submission, clauses that turned wives into chattel and children into pawns in a perpetual game of land rights. The initial reaction from the wives of the brass-ankle brothers was a mixture of fear and muted dissent. Sarah, Silas's wife, a woman known for her quiet fortitude, was the first to realize the disturbing implications. The covenant wasn't just about land. It was about the absolute subjugation of the family line to the will of the surviving brother, or brothers. The document essentially stripped them of any legal autonomy, turning their very marriages into conditional land rights contracts. Clause 4, the most horrifying provision in the early drafts, stated that any widow who chose to leave the Willow Creek property after her husband's death would forfeit all inheritance, not just the land, but all movable property, and, most macabre of all, the custody of her children, who would remain as permanent wards of the estate. This wasn't merely inheritance law. It was psychological warfare designed to ensure compliance through emotional blackmail. The brothers used the promise of generational wealth, cloaked in the dread of losing everything, to coerce their family. This creepy control wasn't overtly violent, but it was profoundly more insidious. The wives were trapped by the very prosperity the brothers created. Where could they go? The frontier was a lonely, dangerous place for a woman alone, and the thought of losing their children to the cold case logic of their in-laws was unthinkable. One by one, under immense pressure, and likely after witnessing veiled, unsettling threats, they signed the initial version of the covenant. The document was then hidden, sealed away in a large, forbidden iron safe that only the brothers had access to. The signing wasn't the end of the arrangement, however. It was just the beginning of a decade-long escalation of dread and suspense. The brothers, now emboldened by their family's capitulation, began to acquire land with even more ruthless abandon, seeing the family not as partners, but as necessary living components of their expanding empire. But as the years passed and children grew into adults, the brothers realized the original covenant wasn't tight enough. The curse of division still lingered. The decade between 1870 and 1879 saw the brass-ankle brothers amass an unparalleled tract of land in Willow Creek Valley, transforming them from ambitious pioneers into near-feudal lords. But time, the ultimate leveler, began to introduce complications the brothers couldn't simply threaten away. Children became suitors. Daughters wished to marry and move to distant towns. Sons expressed interests in careers that had nothing to do with farming or land stewardship. This emergence of individual will, this natural desire for autonomy, was viewed by Silas, Elias, and Tobias as a direct, macabre threat to their unified domain, a viral infection that had to be contained. The most pressing problem was the marriage of Silas's eldest daughter, Clara. She was engaged to a young man from the next county, a Cartwright, and planned to move away after the wedding. Under the original covenant, she would lose her future claim, but her siblings would still retain theirs, and her absence created a physical, symbolic gap in the family's presence on the land. This was an intolerable fracture. It led to the second, far more disturbing revision of the Covenant of the Soil, the one that was presented in the opening scene in 1879. The forbidden new clauses were designed to lock the second generation into the Willow Creek prison, essentially creating a band system of arranged marriages and forced cohabitation. This is where the story pivots from mere greed to true psychological horror. The new document demanded that all children, upon reaching the age of 21, must marry only within a select, pre-approved circle of local, landless families, ensuring their in-laws would also become tethered to the brass ankle domain as tenants or overseers. And the final, macabre blow, all newly married couples were forbidden from establishing independent homes. They were required to live within the original, ever-expanding farmhouse, a forced, creepy community of the cursed lineage. The atmosphere in the Willow Creek farmhouse was not one of familial warmth, but of slow, escalating dread. Imagine living under the same roof with your uncles, not as loving relatives, but as perpetual judges and jailers. The brothers enforced the covenant with a chilling, bureaucratic efficiency. The large, rambling farmhouse became less a home and more a living monument to their obsession. Every new addition to the family, every wedding, every birth, was just another rivet hammered into the structure of their collective, forbidden confinement. The younger generation grew up knowing only the shadow of the covenant. They were raised with the knowledge that their primary purpose was not to pursue happiness, but to anchor the family's claim to the soil. Their education was rudimentary, their social interactions strictly policed, and their futures were already decided by the cold, unyielding dictates of their fathers and uncles. Any sign of independent thought was met with a terrifying, unified censure that spoke volumes without needing a single shout. The children's childhoods vanished into the endless, supervised chores and the omnipresent, macabre tension that hung in the air. This was the true genius of the brass ankle plan, to make the very thought of separation feel like a betrayal punishable by exile and destitution. The brothers didn't just control the land, they controlled the emotional and psychological landscape of their entire lineage. But this level of control is inherently unstable. Pressure builds, and by 1879 the pressure had become unbearable. One daughter, it is rumored, attempted to run away, a cold case that was quickly and brutally resolved, leaving only whispers of a forced, immediate return. The second revision of the covenant was now due to be signed, solidifying these disturbing new arrangements, and the resistance, though silent, was finally reaching its breaking point. This is where the story shifts from the psychological horror of the contract to the very real physical presence of the curse they brought upon themselves. The night of the 1879 family gathering was heavy and oppressive, a perfect backdrop for the macabre drama about to unfold. The younger generation, now adults or nearly so, sat rigid around the dining table. They were fully aware that this meeting was not a discussion but a decree. The sight of the thick, parchment document, the covenant, now bound in dark leather and marked with the brothers' creepy personal seal, sent a wave of cold realization through the room. This was the moment their last vestiges of freedom would be signed away. Elias, who had taken the role of family patriarch after Silas's health began to fail, cleared his throat. His voice, usually a low, menacing rasp, was oddly calm as he began to read the new clauses. He spoke of generational unity, of protecting the inheritance, and of the sacred obligation to the brass ankle soil. These were the euphemisms the brothers used to cloak their forbidden greed. But the real meat of the new covenant was Clause 9, which outlined the horrifying new truth. From this night forward, all land rights were consolidated under a single, perpetual trust, overseen by the surviving brother or brothers. The children would only receive the usufruct, the right to use and profit from the land, but never the right to sell, mortgage, or divide it. And here is the disturbing twist, the final anchor. The trust could only be terminated if every living member of the family, spouses, children, and grandchildren, agreed in writing. An impossible condition designed to ensure the trust's permanence. But there was a provision even darker than this legal trap, a clause so banned and extreme that it makes the initial arrangement seem tame. It involved the use of the very brass key Elias held, and it was a secret kept for 10 long years. As Elias finished reading the legalistic preamble, a small, choked sound escaped from his niece, Martha, Silas's second daughter. She was known to be the most rebellious of the second generation, her spirit not yet completely broken by the macabre atmosphere of the farmhouse. Elias fixed her with a gaze so cold and unblinking it seemed to absorb all the light in the room. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden, absolute silence that fell was far more disturbing than any verbal threat. He then produced the heavy, antique key made of brass, identical to the rings of their childhood, which had been concealed beneath his coat. With an unnerving slowness, he walked to the far end of the room, to a section of the wall that appeared solid and unremarkable. He inserted the key into a nearly invisible lock, a forbidden lock that had been cleverly concealed behind a piece of decorative molding. There was a sickening thunk as the lock released, and a section of the wall slid inward, revealing a creepy hidden alcove. Inside was not a ledger or a deed, but 3 small, tarnished brass boxes. The family watched transfixed, their dread transforming into an active, horrifying terror. What secrets had been vanished behind that wall? Elias returned to the table and placed the 3 boxes before the assembled family. "These," he announced, his voice barely a whisper, "are the true anchors of the covenant. They contain the guarantee that no one will ever break our arrangement." The suspense was agonizing. The young men and women around the table, raised in an environment of calculated fear, had never suspected this hidden compartment. It was the cold case of the family's loyalty, waiting to be opened. Elias picked up the first box, his hands trembling slightly, and with a terrible, slow movement, he unlocked the clasp. The contents of the first brass box, when revealed, did not contain gold or jewels, but something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more disturbing. It contained the original legal marriage certificates for Silas, Elias, and Tobias, but they were not intact. Each certificate had been meticulously, almost surgically altered. The names of the presiding ministers, the witnesses, and the registration dates had all been carefully scraped away, rendering them completely invalid in the eyes of the law. Instead, they were replaced with a single, handwritten note, sealed with the family's macabre crest, bound only by the soil, null and void by the authority of the brass ankle. Elias explained, his voice chillingly matter-of-fact. 10 years ago, we chose to void our marriages in the eyes of man. The women of this family are legally single. You have no legal claim upon us or our estate. Your claim rests entirely upon the integrity of this covenant, which we now ask you to reaffirm." The realization was a horrifying punch to the gut. The wives, Sarah, Eleanor, and Rebecca, had been living a lie for a decade, their status as wives and mothers a mere arrangement contingent upon their silence and compliance. If they left, they wouldn't just be widows forfeiting a claim. They would be single women with no legal standing, their children technically illegitimate wards of the state, or, more accurately, wards of the remaining brothers. This was a masterstroke of band control, a forbidden act that stripped the women of their very identity. The sheer, calculating depravity of the act transformed the legal document into a tool of emotional enslavement. The atmosphere in the room was electric with shock, dread, and a sense of betrayal so profound it was almost physical. This revelation, though disturbing, was only the opening salvo. Elias moved on to the second box, promising a truth that was even more creepy and devastating than the first. The sheer audacity of the Brass Ankle brothers' actions solidified their place in the dark history of Willow Creek Valley. Eleanor, Elias' own wife, a woman who had always maintained a veneer of calm, finally shattered. A silent tear traced a path down her cheek, a sign of the profound, crushing realization of her decade-long deception. She hadn't married the man she thought she had. She had entered into a macabre, unofficial contract that could be dissolved at the whim of the three brothers. But before the shock could fully register, Elias moved on to the second brass box, not allowing a single moment for discussion or dissent. Opened it, and the contents were, in their quiet way, far more disturbing than the voided documents. Inside lay three neatly folded, antique linen baby blankets, the very blankets in which the three eldest children of the next generation had been swaddled. Attached to each blanket was a small, crudely engraved brass tag. Elias read the inscription on the first one, the blanket belonging to Martha, the rebellious niece, property of the Brass Ankle estate, assigned land unit 4, value contingent. The realization hit the young people with the force of a physical blow. Their birth certificates, too, had been manipulated or never properly filed. In a shocking, forbidden act, the brothers had legally designated their own children and nieces' nephews not as heirs, but as chattel, as banned assets tied directly to specific tracts of land. This wasn't merely about inheritance. It was about commodifying their own bloodline to ensure the land remained intact. The land must be tended, Elias explained, his voice a creepy monotone. And the tenders must be tied to the soil in perpetuity. You are the guarantee. Your right to the land, such as it is inseparable from your function on the land. This elevated the covenant from a simple inheritance arrangement to a horrific, multi-generational form of psychological slavery. The fear in the room had curdled into a helpless, horrifying despair. The children, now realizing their entire lives were a cold case of manufactured identity, looked to their mothers, who could offer no comfort. But there was still one box left, the smallest, most tarnished, and arguably the most macabre of all. Short break in the narrative for a subtle viewer engagement hook, designed to be part of the flow. The Brass Ankle brothers understood the chilling power of the quiet threat. They didn't need to brandish a weapon. They simply revealed the truth of their deception, turning the very structure of their family into a cage of their own design. The first two boxes revealed the destruction of the family's past and present identity. But the last box, the third, promises to reveal the disturbing future they had planned. If you are gripped by this slow-burn descent into macabre history and want to hear more of these forbidden tales that time tried to bury, take a moment now to subscribe. What Elias is about to reveal next is the final, horrifying mechanism of control, the one that guaranteed their arrangement would last beyond the grave. Elias, the stoic enforcer, approached the third box with a deliberate, unnerving slowness. The youngest members of the family, mere teenagers, were now openly weeping, their adolescent understanding of the world shattered by the creepy reality of their lineage. The third box was locked not with a key, but with a complex combination lock. This detail, small as it was, spoke volumes. It meant the secret within was considered the most precious and the most banned. After a tense minute, the tumblers clicked and Elias raised the lid. Inside lay not a document or a personal item but a small, carefully preserved vial of dark, dried earth. The soil looked unremarkable, just dark, rich Willow Creek earth. Yet the atmosphere in the room tightened instantly, thick with suspense and dread. "This," Elias announced, holding the vial up to the flickering lamplight, "is the sacred component. It is the literal foundation of the covenant." The family, already numb with shock, waited for the explanation of this final, macabre object. It was, Elias began, a guarantee against the unthinkable, the voluntary severance from the Brass Ankle land. The vial of soil, the ultimate macabre symbol, was the key to the final, horrifying clause in the covenant of the soil. Elias explained that this earth, taken from the very center of their original claim, was to be mixed with a special, concentrated mineral compound, a formula the brothers had painstakingly developed over years. The disturbing instruction was this: every person who signed the revised covenant, from the oldest wife to the youngest child, was required to ingest a small, dissolved portion of this prepared earth. "It is a symbolic oath," Elias stated, "a physical declaration that you are of the soil, and the soil is of you. It is the final binding." The creepy ritual was designed to seal the arrangement in a way that mere ink could not, a physical, emotional, and pseudo-religious tethering. But the truth was far more banned than mere symbolism. It's here, at this point of pure psychological horror, that we uncover the brothers' deepest, most forbidden secret. This wasn't just dirt and minerals. The mineral compound they had mixed in was not a harmless dye or flavor. It was a slow-acting, untraceable poison, a substance designed to remain inert in the system for many years, but which would, eventually, lead to a drawn-out, agonizing, and ultimately fatal illness. Elias didn't reveal this detail, of course, but the implication was clear to those who truly feared the brothers. This Earth was a biological time bomb. Any family member who dared to break the covenant, who attempted to leave the land or challenge the brothers' authority, would not only face the ruin of their legal standing, but would also accelerate the onset of this curse. The brothers had created the perfect instrument of perpetual control, guaranteeing that even if they vanished, the next generation would remain, bound by their very biology to the macabre legacy of the brass ankle soil. The silence in the room following the revelation of the final, disturbing condition was absolute, a creepy silence heavy with the unspoken knowledge of betrayal. The wives, though already stripped of their legal standing, now faced a new and profound horror, a physical threat to their very lives and the lives of their children. The true nature of the symbolic oath was understood through the years of suspense and dread the brothers had cultivated. No one had to say, "It's poison." The terrifying certainty was enough. One by one, the family members, the children, the wives, and even the aging, sickly Silas were forced to approach the table. Elias, the cold, unfeeling executioner of the plan, stood guard as Tobias, the former charmer now turned grim facilitator, measured out a teaspoon of the prepared earth mixture into small glasses of river water. The act was a macabre parody of a religious sacrament. The children, their faces pale with fear, were the first to comply, coerced by the desperate pleas of their mothers. Martha, the girl who had cried out earlier, hesitated, her small act of rebellion extinguished by the sight of the vial and the profound understanding of her own mortality. She looked to her father, Silas, for help, but Silas, broken by his own complicity and perhaps already suffering from the initial, slow effects of the poison he himself had concocted, merely gave a resigned, horrifying shake of his head. He was as much a prisoner of the covenant as they were. This was the moment the brass ankle legacy was sealed, not with ink, but with blood and internalized curse. The forced ingestion was the ultimate, forbidden arrangement, ensuring that the land would remain undivided for a generation, perhaps two. But the long-term consequences of this banned act of control would echo for decades, creating a cold case of generational illness and vanished hope. The signing and the forced oath marked the climax of the night, but not the end of the disturbing family drama. With the covenant renewed and the macabre ritual complete, the underlying tension in the farmhouse did not dissipate. It merely calcified. The second generation, now fully aware of their terrifying legal and physical predicament, moved through their lives with a new, profound sense of helplessness. They were tethered to the soil by a chain far stronger than the brass rings of their fathers, a chain of forbidden chemicals and existential threat. Life on the brass ankle property continued, outwardly successful and prosperous. They had the land, they had the crops, and they had the wealth. But inside the rambling, creepy farmhouse, a curse had been silently unleashed. Over the next 5 years, the first subtle signs of the poison began to emerge. A creeping, inexplicable fatigue. Chronic, internal pain that doctors in the nearest town could not diagnose, leading them to dismiss the ailments as hysteria or the rigors of frontier life. The symptoms were subtle, slow burn, and easily attributed to other causes, exactly as the brothers had planned. This was the beauty and the horror of their system. The family members were forced to live and work the land, knowing that the very soil they tended held the keys to their impending doom. It fostered an environment of intense paranoia and suspense. Who knew how much they had ingested? Who was getting sicker faster? And the brothers, Silas, Elias, and Tobias, did they take the same oath? This uncertainty was the ultimate form of control. The brothers, aging now and perhaps facing the realization of their own macabre mortality, needed to ensure the covenant would outlive them. But in doing so, they created the conditions for the eventual, horrifying crack in their armor. The true test of the brass ankle covenant came with the passing of the eldest brother, Silas, in 1885. His death was drawn out and agonizing, a disturbing testament to the slow-acting nature of the compound he himself had helped create. While doctors attributed his death to consumption brought on by the damp frontier, the family knew the macabre truth. His passing, however, was immediately seized upon by Elias and Tobias as a demonstration of the covenant's absolute power. According to the arrangement, Silas's legal non-wife, Sarah now had a choice: remain on the land under the authority of the surviving brothers, or leave, losing her children and any claim to the estate, all while the latent curse within her system remained an active threat. Sarah, now a matriarch consumed by a creepy mix of grief and fear, chose to stay. She became a silent, watchful shadow in the farmhouse, her compliance ensuring the safety of her children, who were now the designated land unit assets of the estate. The seamless transition of power to Elias and Tobias, the land remaining undivided, served as a terrifying reinforcement for the second generation. The system worked. The forbidden cycle was perpetuated. Yet, Silas's death also opened up a small, unseen seam in the brothers' monolithic control. His personal papers, previously sealed, were briefly accessed by his eldest son, Thomas, before Elias could secure them. In those papers, Thomas found a cryptic, fragmented note written in Silas's shaky hand, a note that spoke of a second vial and a permanent solution kept in a separate banned place. This clue, a mere wisp of a whisper from beyond the grave, became the spark of hope, or perhaps the final horrifying descent for the imprisoned generation. The truth, already buried deep, had now begun to whisper its way out, turning a cold case of succession into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Thomas, Silas's son, was the designated inheritor of his father's quiet, calculating mind. He didn't speak of the note he found. He didn't dare. To reveal the clue would be to invite the immediate, horrifying scrutiny of Elias, a man whose paranoia had only intensified since his brother's death. Instead, Thomas began a secret, years-long investigation into the nature of the forbidden poison and the potential existence of an antidote, or at least a way to neutralize the slow-acting curse. He maintained the appearance of a loyal son of the brass ankle soil, working the fields and executing the disturbing terms of the covenant without complaint. His wife, whom he was forced to marry under the arrangement, was his only confidant, and their shared secret was a source of both terror and strength. Thomas's investigation was a slow-burn, macabre process. He traveled to the nearest city under the pretense of selling cattle, but instead spent his time in dusty libraries and apothecaries, meticulously cross-referencing Silas's fragmented notes with toxicology texts from Europe and old medicinal manuals. What he discovered confirmed his deepest dread. The compound was a blend of heavy metals common in certain mining processes, specifically chosen for its subtle, slow-onset symptoms that mimicked natural diseases. It was a banned and sophisticated form of murder. The second vial Silas mentioned, Thomas deduced, must contain the concentrated antidote, or at least the raw, pure agent required to develop one. But where would Silas have hidden something so precious and so creepy? It was a question that became Thomas's obsession, a suspenseful secret mission conducted directly under the watchful, unblinking eyes of his surviving uncles. The vanished hope of freedom now rested entirely on finding this single, hidden counteragent. The pressure on Thomas to find the banned antidote was immense, not just from the ticking clock of the poison in his own system, but from the accelerating decline of his peers. His younger sister, Martha, the one who had cried during the signing, was now showing the most advanced symptoms. Her decline was a visible, horrifying reminder of the family's curse. Tobias, the second-to-last brother, died 2 years after Silas, his final days marked by the same inexplicable, agonizing pain. His passing solidified Elias' reign as the sole, absolute patriarch, his control now total and unchallengeable, or so he thought. Elias, a man completely consumed by his land obsession, was becoming increasingly paranoid. He saw shadows of dissent everywhere and began to enforce the covenant with a truly macabre zeal. He instituted a system of near-constant surveillance, forcing family members to report on one another. The farmhouse, once just a creepy home, now felt like a high-security prison. Thomas realized he had to act fast, before the disturbing atmosphere completely suffocated all hope, and before Elias' declining health led him to take a final, forbidden act of destruction to secure the land. Using the fragmented notes from Silas's papers, Thomas focused his search on the most unlikely place, the original cold case boundary marker of the brass ankle claim. This was a place steeped in the family's dark history, the very spot where their father had symbolically, and perhaps literally, buried his own claim decades before. The notes suggested a permanent solution would be found, where the first stone was laid. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble, forcing Thomas to leave the immediate, watched confines of the farm for the remote, suspenseful edge of the property. The site of the original boundary marker was a remote, heavily wooded corner of the property, a place rarely visited due to its difficult terrain, and the general dread associated with it. It was a location linked to the death of their father's rival decades ago, another cold case conveniently buried by the brass ankle's rising power. Thomas chose the darkest, most moonless night for his search, taking only his most trusted tool, a specialized, small spade designed for delicate excavation. The air was heavy, the shadows seemed to shift and watch, lending a truly macabre feeling to the scene. He spent hours meticulously clearing the overgrowth, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and desperate hope. Finally, he unearthed a large, flat slab of river stone, the very first stone his father had laid. It was not a simple marker, though. When Thomas scraped away the centuries of moss and soil, he found a crudely engraved cipher, a forbidden sequence of numbers and letters, a final message from his grandfather. The cipher itself was complex, a code designed to be broken only by someone who understood the original, disturbing family secret. After nearly an hour of tense, frantic work by the light of a heavily shielded lantern, Thomas cracked the code. The message wasn't a location but an instruction, an arrangement for a key. It directed him back to the original farmhouse, specifically to the hidden alcove where Elias had revealed the 3 brass boxes. But the instruction was not to search inside the alcove. It was to find the hidden twin, a creepy mirror to the first. Thomas made the treacherous journey back to the farmhouse just before dawn, his mind racing with the macabre certainty of what he had to do. The suspense was nearly unbearable. Elias was an early riser, and the slightest misstep would mean the immediate, horrifying end of his mission, and quite possibly his life. He slipped back into the main house, his footsteps silent on the cold, wooden floor. He approached the wall where the hidden alcove lay, the site of the infamous 1879 gathering, now a monument to their family's curse. He began to tap gently along the wall surrounding the known alcove, his ear pressed against the cold plaster. After several terrifying minutes, he found it, a slight, hollow sound about 2 feet to the left of the original. The instruction from the cipher had been correct, a hidden twin. This new alcove was even more expertly concealed, requiring not a brass key, but a specific pattern of pressure points to release the lock, a system designed only for the eldest male heir, a final band secret from his grandfather to his father, and now to him. With a final, desperate push on the correct spot, the panel slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing a cavity deeper and darker than the first. Inside lay a single, much larger, highly polished brass chest, a true treasure box, a complete cold case of forbidden family knowledge. Thomas barely allowed himself a breath of relief before he opened it. Inside the polished brass chest lay the disturbing answer Thomas had risked everything to find. There was indeed a sealed vial, a second vial, but it didn't contain an antidote. Instead, it contained a highly concentrated viscous fluid that seemed to glow faintly in the dark, creepy light. Next to it was a small, macabre ledger bound in black hide. Thomas Torr opened the ledger first. It was a complete, meticulously detailed account kept by Silas, charting the entire history of the poison and the covenant. The first page contained the full, forbidden formula for the slow-acting compound, a detailed list of its ingredients, and most horrifying of all, the precise rate of degradation it would cause in the human body. It also confirmed that the brothers had ingested the same compound, albeit a slightly less potent mixture, ensuring their continued control through shared destiny and a terror of the consequences. But the ledger revealed a far greater banned truth. The second vial did not contain an antidote, it contained the accelerant. This was the final, suspenseful insurance policy. If any family member ever threatened to expose the covenant or challenge their authority, the remaining brother could administer this highly concentrated substance, bringing about a swift, agonizing death that would be mistaken for a sudden, severe flare-up of the long-term illness. The purpose of this chest wasn't to offer a way out. It was to ensure there was absolutely no escape, a curse with a short fuse trigger. The truth of the brass ankle legacy had now reached its most horrifying level of depravity. The arrangement was not merely a contract of bondage, it was a pact of death. The realization that the second vial was an accelerant and not an antidote shattered Thomas's last flicker of hope for a peaceful resolution. The macabre nature of his uncle's control was total. His father, Silas, had kept this secret, not as a desperate measure of defense, but as a final, banned weapon to maintain the integrity of the land, even from beyond the grave. Thomas, however, saw the dark truth. The only way to save his family was to dismantle the entire creepy system, and the only way to do that was to use the brothers' own weapons against them. His new, disturbing plan was born in the silent hours before dawn, to expose the truth of the covenant and the poison to the outside world, and to do so, he needed undeniable proof. The ledger was the key, but Elias' paranoia made any immediate move impossible. He had to create a distraction, a profound shift in the farmhouse's routine that would allow him to copy the ledger's contents and secure the vials. The opportunity came in the form of Elias' growing frailty. The slow-acting poison, even in its reduced concentration, was finally taking its toll. Elias was becoming weaker, his once ironclad will now punctuated by periods of debilitating fatigue and fever. This decline presented a small, terrifying window of opportunity. Thomas began to subtly alter Elias' nightly medicinal tea, adding a small amount of an herbal sedative he had acquired during his trips, ensuring the patriarch's sleep would be deep and unnaturally long on the chosen night. The stage was set for a final, suspenseful confrontation with the remnants of the brass ankle legacy, a clash that would either liberate the family or seal their fate forever in a cold case of forbidden family history. The night Thomas chose for his desperate act was marked by a fierce thunderstorm, the kind that shook the old farmhouse to its very foundations, a fitting backdrop for the horrifying reckoning. He had successfully administered the sedative to Elias T hours before. Now, in the dead of night, with the rain hammering against the roof and the house in absolute, creepy silence, Thomas crept back to the hidden alcove. He retrieved the ledger and the vials. The first task was to copy the ledger. He couldn't risk taking the original, which Elias might immediately miss. He worked quickly, his hand cramped but steady, transcribing the disturbing formulas and the explicit, macabre clauses of the covenant onto his own hidden parchment. The sound of the thunder seemed to cover the frantic scratching of his pen. This document, his own copy, was the final piece of evidence needed to break the arrangement. But the greatest risk remained, confronting the potential consequences. If Elias awoke, if the sound of his movements alerted anyone, the mission would fail, and the family would remain bound by the curse. After securing his copy, Thomas had to decide what to do with the vials. He couldn't simply destroy them, they were physical proof. And more banned still, he realized he could use the accelerant as a final, desperate bargaining chip. He decided to replace the vials with harmless, inert duplicates, hiding the real ones. the poison and the accelerant, in a place only he knew, turning them into a final, powerful suspense element. This was the moment the cold case of the family's misery moved from passive endurance to active rebellion. As Thomas secured the vials and his copied evidence, a soft, deliberate cough echoed from the end of the long hallway, a sound that instantly froze the blood in his veins. Elias was awake. The sedative had failed to hold him completely. Thomas reacted instantly, sliding the ledger back into the chest and slamming the alcove door shut, leaving the subtle click of the lock as his only betraying sound. He stood still, blending into the deep shadows, the scent of the damp, macabre earth from his earlier excavation clinging to his clothes. Elias, a gaunt, creepy silhouette in his nightshirt, stood leaning heavily on the doorframe, his gaze sweeping the darkened hall. The suspense was agonizing. He hadn't seen Thomas, but he clearly sensed a disturbance, a fracture in the absolute control he had wielded for so long. Is someone there? Elias rasped, his voice weak but still carrying the old, familiar threat. Thomas knew he could not hide. He had to face the patriarch and feign a reasonable, common excuse for being awake. He stepped out of the shadows, his face a mask of concern. "Uncle Elias, I heard the thunder and was coming to check on you. The storm is terrible tonight." Elias' eyes, roomy and distant, narrowed in suspicion. He studied Thomas for a long, disturbing moment, his mind working through the implications of his nephew's sudden presence. He didn't believe the excuse. The years of forbidden suspicion and control had honed his instincts to a fine, sharp point. "You are too concerned, Thomas. A man who owns the land does not fear the rain. He welcomes it." Elias slowly shuffled down the hallway, deliberately heading toward the wall where the alcove was hidden. The final confrontation had begun. Elias' slow, deliberate approach to the wall was a terrifying piece of psychological theater. He didn't need to accuse. His very movement was the horrifying accusation. Thomas knew if Elias checked the alcove and found the ledger slightly misplaced, or if he noticed the subtle, disturbing alteration in the contents of the vials, his life would be over. The family's chance for freedom would vanish into the darkness. Thinking quickly, Thomas seized on the only remaining card, his own impending illness. He staggered slightly, clutching his side dramatically, and let out a choked gasp of pain. "Uncle, the fever has returned. I feel the illness deep in my bones." He made the symptoms look acute and undeniable, mimicking the specific signs of the curse he knew so well. Elias stopped instantly, his eyes widening with a flicker of pure animal fear. His paranoia about his own deteriorating health was the one thing that outweighed his suspicion of Thomas. He saw in his nephew's feigned agony a terrifying mirror of his own fate. The sight of the accelerated symptoms, which Thomas knew would eventually come for them all, was enough to momentarily override his focus on the alcove. The suspense broke with Elias turning, his obsession momentarily shifting from the security of the covenant to the frailty of his own macabre body. "Get to your bed, boy. You will not bring your sickness into this hall. I will not have my lineage compromised by weakness." Elias hissed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger. Thomas used the opportunity to retreat, playing the part of the suffering victim, his hand clutching the forbidden copy of the ledger beneath his nightshirt. The ruse had worked, buying him precious time, but the encounter had confirmed a creepy truth. Elias would stop at nothing to maintain his control, and the final battle for the brass ankle estate was now a race against time, curse, and creeping madness. The next day, the farmhouse was thick with suspense, and the knowledge of the previous night's secret confrontation. Thomas, feigning weakness and fever, remained in bed, giving him the cover he needed to plan his final move and secure the transcribed evidence. Elias, rattled by his own near encounter with the symptoms of the curse, spent the day in the library, poring over the original Macabre covenant, reinforcing his own belief in its absolute, forbidden power. He was preparing for one final, devastating act of control. He intended to legally amend the covenant one last time, making it even more disturbing by explicitly forbidding any attempt to seek outside medical help for the family's unexplained illness, a direct response to Thomas's feigned sickness. This was the final tightening of the screw, the last act of a dying tyrant determined to take his family with him. Thomas knew he couldn't wait any longer. His plan was now simple and horrifying in its necessity: to use the banned truth as a weapon of exposure, not revenge. He had to get the evidence out of the house and into the hands of an honest, official source. He chose his eldest daughter, a girl of 16 who had shown both great courage and a subtle understanding of the family's cold case predicament. He revealed the entire arrangement to her: the sickness, the vanished truth of their lineage, and the existence of the Caped ledger, a truly disturbing and necessary burden to place on a child. Thomas entrusted his daughter with the forbidden Caped ledger, giving her specific, meticulous instructions. She was to take a horse and ride hard for the county seat, over 70 miles away. She was not to stop, not to speak to anyone, and under no circumstances was she to reveal the contents of the parchment to any family member. She was to take it directly to the office of Judge Harlan, a man known for his unflinching honesty and his old, creepy distaste for the Brass Ankle brothers' ruthless expansion. It was a massive, macabre risk. If she was caught, the consequences would be unimaginable. Her escape had to be seamless. Under the guise of an early morning errand to a neighboring farm, a trip that was often permitted, the girl slipped away before the household was fully awake. The hours that followed were an agonizing stretch of suspense for Thomas and his wife. They went through the motions of their daily duties, every sound, every shadow a potential sign of betrayal or failure. Elias, still steeped in his self-imposed illness watch, did not leave the library, but the silence itself was a form of dread. The girl's mission was the last roll of the dice. If the evidence reached Judge Harlan, the entire, horrifying structure of the covenant would finally be exposed, leading to a legal and criminal investigation that could tear down the Brass Ankle empire. But if she failed, if she were caught and forced to reveal her mission, the final, banned fate of the family would be sealed with the swift administration of the accelerant. The daughter's ride was a desperate, creepy blur across the dusty miles, but the immense distance provided a needed layer of security. She reached the county seat exhausted but resolute. Judge Harlan, a man in his late 60s with a reputation as an unforgiving arbiter of frontier justice, initially dismissed the girl as another farmhand making a trivial request. But the girl's quiet intensity, her pallor, and the urgent, macabre nature of her plea convinced him to hear her. She presented the Caped ledger, the handwritten forbidden clauses, and the simple, disturbing truth. The Brass Ankle family was being held captive and slowly poisoned by its own patriarch, Elias, under the terms of a contract he had engineered to guarantee the perpetual unity of the land. Judge Harlan, a man who had seen the brutal realities of the frontier, was still stunned. The details of the voided marriages, the designation of the children as land unit assets, and the final, horrifying inclusion of the poison were beyond the pale of any law he had ever encountered. The entire arrangement was not just illegal, it was a criminal enterprise of the most banned and secretive kind. Harlan immediately understood the gravity of the situation and the extreme danger Thomas and the rest of the family were in. The Brass Ankle wealth and influence meant a slow, bureaucratic response would be fatal. He moved with a swift, unprecedented decision, dispatching a small contingent of deputies to Willow Creek Valley with explicit, secret orders to secure the farmhouse and bring Elias back for questioning. The long, cold case of the Brass Ankle brothers was finally about to be cracked open. Back at the Willow Creek farmhouse, the suspense was about to break. Elias, despite his growing illness, sensed a change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the obedience of the household. His gaze fell upon Thomas's wife, a woman who had previously been the most compliant, who now met his eye with a new, quiet defiance. His paranoia, magnified by the slow-acting curse, instantly linked her to Thomas's feigned illness and the vague disturbance of the previous night. He moved with a speed Thomas hadn't seen in years. He summoned his few remaining loyal hands, hardened men whose allegiance was bought and paid for, and ordered them to seal the farmhouse. No one was to leave. He then strode directly to the hidden alcove. He opened the lock with a single, trembling hand and retrieved the 3 brass boxes. He looked at the ledger, then at the 2 vials, and his disturbing paranoia was confirmed. The vials were not the same. Thomas had managed to replace them, subtly but effectively. The realization of the final, horrifying betrayal sent Elias into a fit of macabre rage. He knew the truth was out. He knew his reign was over. In his final, banned act of control, he intended to execute the ultimate clause of the covenant, to ensure that if he could not hold the land, no one else would either. He grabbed the last vial, the real accelerant, and rushed into the main hall, his intention chillingly clear: mass murder to secure the undivided soil. Elias' final rampage was a scene of pure, macabre horror. He burst into the central common area, brandishing the vial of accelerant like a dark, forbidden scepter. His eyes, wild and inflamed with fever and rage, scanned the room for Thomas, but Thomas was already in the doorway, armed not with a weapon, but with the terrifying power of exposure. The remaining family members, the wives, the grown children, the grandchildren, were frozen in place, finally witnessing the absolute disturbing truth of the man who had controlled their lives. Elias' shaky hand fumbled with the vial stopper. "You betrayed me. You betrayed the soil. The land will not be divided. If you will not live for it, you will die for it," he screamed, his voice cracking with his final, creepy madness. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Elias and the rest of the family. "It's over, Uncle. The truth is out. Your covenant, your poison, your arrangement, it is all exposed. There are men coming now from the county seat." The mention of the county seat, of official, outside interference, seemed to momentarily short-circuit Elias' fury. He hesitated, the ultimate suspense hanging in the air. The vial remained uncorked. But it was too late. The sound of rapid, heavy hooves and men shouting broke through the storm. Judge Harlan's deputies had arrived. The arrival of the deputies was a chaotic, rapid-fire end to the brass ankle reign. They stormed the farmhouse, their presence a jarring, banned intrusion on the sealed world of the covenant. Elias, seeing the uniformed men, let out a final, horrifying scream of denial and lifted the vial to his own lips, intending to administer the accelerant and take his own life rather than face justice. But Thomas, who had anticipated this final, macabre act, tackled him just as the vial reached his mouth. The glass shattered on the floor, the concentrated, viscous fluid spreading in a small, dark pool, its toxic fumes filling the air with a faint, metallic odor. The deputies quickly subdued the raving patriarch, securing him with heavy rope. The family, now witnessing the physical evidence of their curse on the floor, collapsed in a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. The nightmare was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The arrest of Elias' brass ankle was a sensation that swept across the frontier. The disturbing contents of the ledger, the voided marriages, the commodification of the children, the forbidden poison, were read aloud in court, turning the secret, creepy history of Willow Creek Valley into a cold case of public record. The brass ankle name, once synonymous with ruthless success, was now synonymous with utter depravity. The arrangement had finally been broken, but the breaking came at a profound, painful cost for all involved. The subsequent criminal trial of Elias' brass ankle was a media circus. The sheer, macabre ingenuity of the covenant was what captivated the public imagination. Lawyers argued for weeks over the nature of the crime. Was it simple murder, or a complex, forbidden form of psychological and chemical enslavement? The voided marriage certificates, the land unit asset designations for the children, and the physical evidence of the vials secured by Thomas provided irrefutable proof of Elias' long-term, disturbing criminal intent. Elias, meanwhile, presented a figure of chilling denial, maintaining a creepy, unnerving silence throughout the proceedings, claiming he was merely protecting his father's legacy and the unity of the cursed soil. The jury, faced with the horrifying details of a generation imprisoned by their own bloodline, did not take long to return a verdict of guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder and unlawful imprisonment. Elias was sentenced to life imprisonment, ensuring the complete and final dismantlement of the covenant. The surviving members of the Brass Ankle family, the wives, the children, and the grandchildren, were finally free. Their legal identities were restored, the land unit designation revoked, and the land itself was legally placed into a temporary outside trust for eventual equitable division. The Brass Ankle Empire was broken, yet their freedom came with a dark, suspenseful caveat. The poison, the slow-acting arrangement they had been forced to ingest years ago, was still within them, a biological cold case waiting to flare up. The aftermath of the trial was fraught with a unique kind of dread. The Brass Ankle family was free from the tyranny of Elias, but they were now faced with the terrifying reality of their own macabre internal condition. The land, the very thing that was the source of their curse and their prison, was now the one place where they could begin to find a solution. Thomas used the detailed formula from the ledger to consult with a team of independent toxicologists, seeking a long-term treatment plan. The diagnosis was grim. The heavy metal compound was slow to leave the body, and while the progress could be halted, the full, disturbing effects were irreversible in many of the older family members. The land itself became a symbol of their trauma. They were free to leave, but the wealth was tied up in the eventual sale and division of the vast estate, and more importantly, they felt a creepy, almost forbidden obligation to the soil, not out of loyalty to their uncles, but out of a shared need to heal on the very ground where they were wounded. Many chose to stay, forming a new, cooperative settlement, working the land not as assets, but as liberated individuals. The cold case of their health was now a lifelong battle, a suspenseful shadow hanging over their newly granted freedom. The Brass Ankle saga had ended with a legal reckoning, but the story of the arrangements and the band control would forever remain a horrifying stain on the history of Willow Creek Valley. Years passed. The children of the Brass Ankle brothers grew up, finally experiencing a life not dictated by the forbidden clauses of a macabre document. They carried the scars, both physical and psychological, of the curse their fathers had inflicted. The farmhouse, the central scene of the disturbing drama, was eventually abandoned. No one could bear to live within its creepy walls, a place where betrayal and fear were etched into the very beams. It stands today, or what remains of it, a stark, suspenseful monument to the depths of human avarice. The land was ultimately divided and sold, the immense profits finally allowing the survivors to seek better medical care and establish true, independent lives far from the shadow of the Brass Ankle name. Thomas, the silent rebel, ensured his daughter received the highest rewards, acknowledging her courage as the true instrument of their liberation. The story, however, refuses to completely vanish. Local folklore in Willow Creek Valley still whispers of the arrangements, tales of the three brothers who loved land more than their own flesh and blood. Visitors report a cold case feeling of dread when traversing the old Brass Ankle property, a sense of being watched, a palpable tension in the air. The final, unsettling question remains: did the survivors ever fully purge the slow-acting poison from their systems? Or did the final, horrifying legacy of the Brass Ankle brothers, the biological curse, continue to claim victims silently, long after Elias was locked away, proving that some band pacts are so dark, they can never truly be broken? Elias Brass Ankle died in prison in 1899, unrepentant to the end. His final macabre statement was simply, "The land is one, you cannot separate it." A chilling epitaph for a man whose entire life was consumed by the forbidden obsession with property. His death closed the final legal chapter of the Brass Ankle saga, but the historical and emotional repercussions continued to ripple outward. The case became a reference point in legal history, a disturbing example of how inheritance law could be twisted into a tool of criminal control. It served as a stark, creepy warning against the absolute power of family-controlled wealth in the lawless vacuum of the frontier. The second generation, now the elders, became fiercely protective of their privacy, ensuring that the next generation knew the history, but not the burden of the name. They understood that the true curse was not the land, nor the poison, but the unchecked greed that led three brothers to enact a horrifying arrangement upon their own flesh and blood. This entire sprawling tale, the psychological warfare the band documents, the chemical control, is a testament to the shadows that exist beneath the veneer of historical prosperity. It forces us to ask, what secrets, what cold case truths, still lie buried in the foundations of the land we stand on? And what macabre pacts were made and enforced to ensure their silence? The legacy of the Brass Ankle brothers, therefore, is not one of great wealth, but one of great dread. It's a suspenseful story of how a singular, disturbing fixation on property could breed a level of control so absolute that it turned family into chattel and love into a mere arrangement for tenure. The farmhouse is now gone, slowly reclaimed by the unforgiving Willow Creek soil. But the memory of the creepy gathering of 1879, the silent signing of the covenant, and the forced ingestion of the cursed earth, that memory remains. It is a tale of a truth that tried to vanish but was forcefully pulled back into the light by the courage of one man and the resilience of a generation. We are left with the lingering, horrifying realization that the most dangerous forbidden histories are often the ones written in blood and sealed by a silent, lifelong macabre lie. The Brass Ankle brothers sought to ensure their legacy was immortal, etched into the very deeds of the land. Instead, their true band legacy is one of a cautionary, chilling cold case, a permanent stain on the record of human cruelty, a whisper on the wind in Willow Creek Valley that warns, be wary of the price of the earth. The question is, are there other similar covenants in other forgotten valleys, still silently claiming their due?